Hey guys, tonight we're uncorking something absolutely unhinged. The true story of a 19th century wine laced with cocaine that got popes, presidents, emperors and opera singers absolutely cooked, legally, elegantly, and usually before lunch. Not a metaphor, not a historical exaggeration. An actual bottle of red wine with actual cocaine in it, sold in actual pharmacies, endorsed by actual world leaders, and reviewed in actual newspapers as a health tonic. This is Vin Mariani, and before you get comfortable, I want to say a genuine, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and you have excellent taste. Probably in wine, maybe in pharmaceuticals. Either way, the channel is better for it, so if you enjoy what we do here, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually mean it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. It is always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere, and I appreciate every single one of you who found this channel in that particular emotional state. We are also now on Spotify. Link is in the description, so if you'd like to fall asleep to this on a long drive or a longer commute, that is an option, and it is a legally distinct experience from the one we're about to discuss. Now dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull your blanket up, and take a second to really settle in, because tonight we're visiting a world where your doctor prescribed wine, your priest drank cocaine, and Thomas Edison personally vouched for a beverage that would absolutely not pass a modern drug test. But let's pause here. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a Victorian gentleman of means, opening a bottle of wine and feeling inexplicably, spectacularly, suspiciously good about everything? Did the cocaine hit fast or slow? Did it feel like confidence or just like a very strong Tuesday? Did Queen Victoria's physician actually recommend it? Or is that the kind of thing that sounds better with age? Could you walk into a 19th century pharmacy, hand over a few francs, and walk out holding what was, by any modern definition, a controlled substance in a wine bottle with a very tasteful label? Did the Pope actually write a testimonial? Was it good? Was there a second bottle? Did the Pope have a second bottle? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1883. The gas lamps are lit, the opera is playing 3 streets over, and somewhere in a gleaming Parisian laboratory, a Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani is about to hand you a glass of something that will change your afternoon, your century, and arguably the entire history of recreational stimulants. The man who put cocaine in wine was not a villain, a criminal, or even a particularly reckless person. He was, by all available evidence, a meticulous, enthusiastic, and deeply capitalistic pharmacist from Corsica with a gift for chemistry and an even greater gift for marketing. Angelo Mariani was born in 1838 on that rocky Mediterranean island that had also produced Napoleon Bonaparte, which tells you something about the particular flavour of ambition the place seemed to cultivate. He moved to Paris in his 20s, set up a pharmaceutical practice, and began studying the properties of coca leaves, the same leaves that indigenous South American populations had chewed for centuries to manage altitude, exhaustion, and the general difficulty of being alive. Mariani was not the first European to notice that coca leaves did something interesting to the human nervous system, but he was the first to understand that the right delivery mechanism could turn a curiosity into a commercial empire. He was, in short, a man who looked at a plant that made people feel better and thought, what if we put this in wine? Paris in the 1860s was the kind of city that rewarded exactly this sort of thinking. The Second Empire was in full flourish under Napoleon III, and the French capital was in the midst of a radical reinvention. Wide new boulevards, gaslit streets, glittering department stores, and a consuming belief that modernity was a project with solutions available to anyone willing to look hard enough. Science was not yet separate from commerce in the way it would later become, and a pharmacist who found something useful was entirely expected to sell it, which Mariani was prepared to do with considerable skill. He set up his laboratory in a building on the Rue de la Paix, a street whose name, Peace, sits with particular irony given what he was about to unleash on the nervous systems of the Parisian bourgeoisie, and began his experiments with coca leaf extraction in earnest. The process Mariani developed was not complicated, but it was precise. He sourced dried coca leaves from Peru, where the plant grew at altitude in quantities sufficient to supply a growing European appetite. He macerated the leaves in wine, specifically a Bordeaux-based wine of decent quality, because Mariani understood that the vehicle mattered, that people who could afford a medical tonic could also afford to notice whether it tasted good. The maceration process allowed the active alkaloids in the leaves, principally cocaine, to dissolve into the wine over time, producing a finished product that is both genuinely palatable and pharmacologically active. He standardized the formula, he tested the dosage, he labeled the bottles carefully. He was, in every sense that the 1960s would have recognized, a craftsman of his product. What distinguished Mariani from the army of patent medicine manufacturers who would follow in his wake was his insistence on quality and consistency. He was not diluting cheap alcohol with random plant material and inventing therapeutic claims from nothing. He was producing a real pharmaceutical preparation with a measurable active ingredient, and he took that responsibility seriously in the way that a trained pharmacist would, right up until the point where the commercial opportunity became large enough that seriousness and enthusiasm became difficult to separate. He kept records. He corresponded with chemists. He read the emerging scientific literature on coca and cocaine with genuine interest. He was also, it must be said, very good at talking to people. His laboratory notebooks were meticulous, but his personality was warm, curious, and relentlessly social. The kind of person who could explain the pharmacology of coca alkaloids to a physician, and then, without changing register, explain to an opera singer why it would help her voice in the second act. He moved easily between worlds. He dined with artists and with doctors and with politicians, and he understood that each of these groups had different reasons to want what he was selling, and he was happy to supply all of them with the reason that fit. The wine went into production in 1863. By the following year it was in pharmacies across Paris. By the end of the decade it was in London, New York and Buenos Aires. The unlikely laboratory on the Rue de la Paix had produced something that the world, as it turned out, had been waiting for without knowing it. A stimulant that came in a nice bottle and had a doctor's note attached. The rest, as they say, was history. Chemically assisted history, but history all the same. Before it was in a fashionable Parisian bottle with a gold label and a papal endorsement, the coca leaf had already been doing its job for approximately 8,000 years, which is the kind of seniority that deserves a little respect. Indigenous peoples across the Andes had been cultivating, chewing, and ceremonially using coca leaves since long before any European had set foot on the continent, and they had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of what it did, when to use it, and how to respect it. Coca was not a party drug in the Inca Empire. It was a sacred, practical, and deeply integrated part of life, chewed by farmers working at altitude, offered to the gods in ceremonies, used by runners carrying messages across the mountains, and distributed to soldiers on long marches. The leaf numbed hunger, reduced fatigue, helped the body cope with thin air at elevation, and provided a steady, manageable kind of clarity that had nothing to do with excess. It was, in other words, doing exactly what Mariani would later advertise it as doing, just without the wine, the European accent, or the celebrity testimonials. You have to understand the conditions in which this made sense. The Andean highlands are not a forgiving environment. You're working at elevations where oxygen is genuinely scarce, where your muscles are burning through energy faster than a diet of maize and potatoes can reliably replace it, where the cold comes down from the peaks at night with a personal quality, as though it has your address. The coca leaf in this context was not a luxury and not an escape. It was a tool, as practical as a good pair of sandals, as necessary as a water vessel, and considerably more interesting than either. Workers chewed the leaves with a small amount of lime or ash, which changed the pH of the mouth slightly and increased the absorption of the alkaloids. They had figured out the chemistry, in practical terms, without knowing the chemistry. That is the kind of knowledge that takes not years but generations to accumulate, and it is worth sitting with the fact that this knowledge was developed, refined, and passed down across centuries before a Corsican pharmacist decided to monetize it. The Inca state recognized coca's value and controlled its production accordingly. In the period of peak Inca power, coca cultivation was restricted to state-controlled terraced farms, and distribution was managed through the same administrative machinery that managed everything else in that extraordinarily organized empire. Coca was given as payment to workers on state labor projects, offered as a tribute to the sun god Inti, and used in ceremonies that mark the major transitions of Andean life: birth, marriage, death, the agricultural calendar. It was not available to everyone all the time. It was a substance that carried weight, that occupied a specific social and spiritual position, that was understood to be powerful and therefore to require management. The Spanish arrived in the 1500s with their own theory about coca, which was that it was the work of the devil and should be suppressed. This position lasted approximately as long as it took the Spanish colonial authorities to discover that the indigenous miners in their silver mines worked longer and harder and complained less when they had coca, at which point the theological objection was quietly retired and coca became a permitted, then encouraged, then commercially exploited element of the colonial labour system. The Spanish were, in this as in many things, willing to adapt their principles to their economic interests with a speed that would be admirable if it were not quite so predictable. By the time European scientists began isolating cocaine from the coca leaf in the 1850s and 60s, Albert Niemann performed the first clean extraction in 1860. The plant had been doing its work for longer than most civilizations had existed. What Mariani did was to take a substance that had been understood and managed and respected by its original cultivators, process it, dissolve it in wine, and sell it to people who'd never heard of the Andes and did not particularly care about the history. That is a story with its own kind of moral weight. The coca leaf's long life before Vin Mariani is not a footnote to the product's story. It is the foundation on which the product was built, and the foundation deserves to be seen. Here is what Mariani understood. Coca leaves contain cocaine as one of their active alkaloids, and cocaine, when absorbed into the bloodstream, does several things that would be considered medically useful in 1860 and commercially useful in any century. It stimulates the central nervous system, suppresses fatigue and appetite, elevates mood, increases heart rate, and produces a feeling of alertness and well-being that most people find, at least initially, quite pleasant. Here is what Mariani also understood. though perhaps less consciously, that wine is acidic and that acid helps extract cocaine from the coca leaf more efficiently than water alone does. This was, in hindsight, either a brilliant pharmacological insight or a very lucky accident, but either way it meant that Vin Mariani contained more bioavailable cocaine per glass than a simple coca tea would have. You were not just getting the flavour of the leaf, you were getting the chemistry. Every bottle of Vin Mariani contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce, which by the standards of the time was considered a therapeutic dose, and by the standards of any subsequent century would be considered a very eventful glass of wine. To understand why this was considered unremarkable at the time, you need to understand what pharmacology looked like in 1863. The discipline was young, approximate, and operating without several of the conceptual tools that would later make it more precise. The germ theory of disease was not yet universally accepted. The mechanism of drug action, the idea of receptors, of neurotransmitters, of the specific biochemical pathways through which substances produce their effects, was entirely unknown. What physicians had was observation. They gave patients things and watched what happened, and if what happened seemed beneficial and the patient did not immediately die, the substance was added to the therapeutic repertoire. This is not as primitive as it sounds, because observation is a genuine scientific tool, but it does mean that the understanding of what cocaine was actually doing inside the body was almost entirely phenomenological. It made people feel better, and therefore it was good for them. The wine base was not pharmacologically neutral, which is a fact that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Alcohol and cocaine interact in the liver to produce a compound called cocaethylene, which is a longer-lasting stimulant than cocaine alone and has its own distinct pharmacological profile. Mariani did not know this. Cocaethylene was not identified until the 1980s, but his wine was producing this compound in everyone who drank it, adding a layer of complexity to the experience that he had not intended and could not have measured. People who drank Vin Mariani were not simply experiencing cocaine plus alcohol. They were experiencing cocaine plus alcohol plus a third compound that neither he nor his customers were aware of. The product was, in this sense, doing more than it said on the label, which in a different regulatory environment would be considered a problem, and in the 1860s was simply considered an excellent result. What Mariani got right was the observation that the product worked, that it relieved fatigue, elevated mood, and made people feel capable in a way that they found genuinely valuable. What he got wrong, insofar as he got anything wrong within the limits of what was knowable at the time, was the assumption that short-term benefits reliably predicted long-term safety. This is a mistake that the history of pharmacology has repeated many times, with substances far better studied than Vin Mariani. The pattern, enthusiastic adoption, apparent therapeutic benefit, gradually accumulating evidence of harm, belated regulation, has played out across the century and a half since Mariani's wine went on sale with a consistency that should probably be more instructive than it has been. The science available to Mariani was real science, conducted by real scientists producing real knowledge. It was simply incomplete in ways that the scientist conducting it could not yet see. Albert Niemann, who first isolated pure cocaine in 1860, described its effects on himself in terms that are both accurate and revealing. The numbing of the tongue, the stimulation, the sense of increased capacity. He died the following year of causes unrelated to his research, which perhaps spared him the experience of observing what extended use produced. The gap between what early cocaine research correctly identified and what it missed is not a gap of carelessness. It is a gap of time, the time it takes for individual observations to accumulate into population patterns, for short-term benefits to reveal their long-term costs, for the medicine cabinet to become the case study. Mariani worked with the science he had. The science, unfortunately, was not yet finished. Mariani launched his product in 1863 with the kind of quiet confidence that only a person who has already tasted the product and understood exactly what it was going to do to people can manage. The wine was initially marketed as a medical preparation, a tonic to be recommended by physicians for the treatment of fatigue, nervous exhaustion, wasting illness, and what Victorians delightfully called neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis that essentially meant you were a modern person and therefore tired. It came in elegant dark bottles with the label featuring the face of a Peruvian coca farmer, a detail that would be re-examined critically by later generations, but at the time read as authenticity, as a direct connection to the source, as proof that this was the real thing. Physicians began prescribing it, pharmacists began stocking it, and patients began returning for it with a regularity that any modern subscription service would envy. Within a few years, Vin Mariani was not just a medical product, it was a cultural object. Paris had fallen in love with the bottle. The launch strategy was methodical, in a way that demonstrated Mariani's understanding of the market he was entering. He did not begin by advertising to the general public. He began by advertising to physicians, distributing samples, corresponding with practitioners, making the product available at no cost to medical men who might then prescribe it to their patients. This was a form of marketing, though not one that would have been recognized by that name at the time. It was the seeding of professional opinion, the cultivation of a medical endorsement infrastructure that would then communicate the product's virtues to patients with the authority that only a doctor's recommendation could carry in a society that trusted medicine almost as much as it trusted religion. By the time Vin Mariani appeared in pharmacy windows and began to be advertised more broadly, it already carried the implicit endorsement of the medical profession, which was a commercial asset of incalculable value. The timing was also, from a purely commercial standpoint, nearly perfect. The 1860s and 70s in France were a period of expanding consumer culture. The department store, the illustrated magazine, the railway poster had all arrived in roughly the same decade, creating an infrastructure for mass marketing that had not existed a generation earlier. Mariani was among the first manufacturers of a medical product to use this infrastructure systematically. His advertisements appeared in the illustrated press with a visual sophistication that was unusual for the period, elegant typography, evocative imagery, the faces of notable endorsers rendered in woodcut or early photographic reproduction. He understood that in a market of rising visual literacy, the appearance of a product was as much a part of its therapeutic claim as its chemical composition. Word of mouth did the rest, and word of mouth, when the product is a stimulant that makes people feel immediately and noticeably better, is an extraordinarily efficient marketing tool. The person who had taken Vin Mariani on a physician's recommendation and found themselves feeling unexpectedly energetic at dinner was very likely to mention this to the person sitting next to them. The opera singer who discovered that a glass before the performance added a dimension to her voice that she had previously only accessed on her best evenings was very likely to tell her colleagues. The diplomat who found that the wine sustained him through the fourth hour of a particularly demanding negotiation was very likely to pass the word. Mariani received testimonials without having to solicit them, initially, because the product produced genuine effect that genuine people wanted to communicate. He then organized and published those testimonials, which is where the operation moved from happy accident to deliberate strategy, and where the story of the wine becomes the story of modern celebrity marketing. The phenomenon, once it had started, was nearly self-sustaining. Each endorsement produced more customers, each customer produced more demand produced more supply, and wider distribution produced more encounters with the product, more experiences of its effects, more occasions for endorsement. Mariani stood at the centre of this system with his notebooks and his sample bottles and his extraordinary capacity for correspondence, and watched something he had made in a laboratory become part of the cultural fabric of the most sophisticated city in the world. He was not naive about what was happening. He was simply very, very pleased about it. Let us be honest about what was happening physiologically when a Victorian gentleman or gentlewoman sat down with a glass of Vin Mariani, because the testimonials alone, and there were hundreds of them, suggest that the experience was somewhat more vivid than a standard Bordeaux. The cocaine in the wine was absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth and throat almost immediately, which meant the effects began before you had even finished the glass. Your mood lifted. The afternoon, which had been dragging, suddenly had texture and interest. You were sharper, more energetic, more talkative. Your appetite diminished slightly, which was considered a benefit rather than a warning sign. Your heart rate increased in a way that felt, at least for the first hour or so, like enthusiasm rather than alarm. You felt, in the particular idiom of the era, restored, revived, equal to whatever the evening had planned for you. The wine itself was a Bordeaux-based blend, genuinely palatable, with the earthy, slightly bitter undertone of the coca leaf adding what reviewers described as a distinctive and agreeable character. It tasted like wine that meant business, because it did. Imagine yourself in 1878. You are a Parisian physician of middle age, moderately prosperous, moderately overworked, and suffering from the particular kind of fatigue that comes not from physical labour, but from the sustained management of other people's problems. It is 4 p.m. You have seen 11 patients. 2 of them were interesting. The rest were the sort of anxious, vaguely symptomatic bourgeois that fill a practice and drain the spirit. Your consulting room smells of tinctures and the remnants of your lunch, which was taken hurriedly between appointments and consisted of bread, cold meat, and something that was almost certainly a turnip. You have 2 more patients before 6 o'clock, and then a dinner at which you will be expected to be charming. You open a bottle of Vin Mariani. You pour a glass of the prescribed dose, which is 2 to 3 small glasses daily with meals. You drink it. The wine is pleasant, genuinely pleasant, not medicinally unpleasant in the way that many of the preparations you recommend to your own patients certainly are. The coca leaf adds something to the Bordeaux base, a slight bitterness that is not unpleasant, a faint aromatic quality, something that suggests the product has arrived from somewhere interesting and foreign and knows things you do not. Within minutes, this is the part that the testimonials kept returning to. The speed. Within minutes you feel different. Not dramatically different. Not hallucinatorily different. Not in a way that would be embarrassing to describe to a colleague. Just better, clearer, more capable. The afternoon has recovered its shape. The 2 remaining patients are seen efficiently and with a quality of attention that the morning appointments, frankly, did not quite receive. The dinner is a success. You're witty. You're present. You remember names and follow conversational threads that would normally slip past you at this hour. You sleep reasonably well, though perhaps with a slight restlessness in the early hours that you attribute to the wine and do not further examine. The following morning you are tired, but not more tired than usual. and you have a sense that the previous afternoon was a better afternoon than it would otherwise have been. You recommend the wine to a patient who is recovering from a respiratory illness and has lost his appetite. He returns 2 weeks later looking considerably improved and wanting to know if he should continue. This is what Vin Mariani felt like in normal use, in the early years, before tolerance had built and before the dose required to produce the original effect had begun to climb. It felt like a solution. It felt like the afternoon you had on your best days, reliably reproduced by means of a bottle that cost considerably less than it should have, given what it delivered. That reliability is precisely what made it appealing, and precisely what made it dangerous, though the danger was invisible in the early stages, tucked inside the relief, indistinguishable from the benefit. It felt, in the particular vocabulary of 19th century experience, like a medical advance. It was. It was simply also something else at the same time, and the something else would take decades to fully name. If there is a single moment that captures the absolute categorical strangeness of the Vin Mariani story, it is this. Pope Leo III, the head of the Catholic Church, the vicar of Christ on earth, the spiritual leader of hundreds of millions of faithful Catholics worldwide, gave Vin Mariani a gold medal and provided a written testimonial stating that he had found the wine to be a source of personal comfort and restorative power during his demanding duties. He allegedly carried a flask of it. He allegedly drank it regularly. He reportedly credited it with sustaining him through the particular rigours of being Pope, which, to be fair, is a demanding job with poor retirement options. Mariani, who understood a marketing opportunity the way a hawk understands a field mouse, printed the papal endorsement everywhere. It appeared in advertisements, in catalogues, in the pages of newspapers across Europe and America. If the Pope drank it, what objection could possibly remain? What moral concern, what medical scruple, what social hesitation could survive the image of the Holy Father reaching for his flask of cocaine wine with evident satisfaction? Leo XIII was not, it should be noted, an obviously dissolute figure. He was a serious scholarly man who had been elected to the papacy in 1878 and would serve until 1903, making his one of the longest pontificates in modern history. A reign of 25 years across, which he managed the Church through the Industrial Revolution, the rise of socialism, the continuing conflict over Italian unification, and a genuinely impressive list of encyclicals on labour, philosophy, and social teaching. He was not a man who appeared in endorsements carelessly or for trivial reasons. He endorsed Vin Mariani because he used it and found it helpful, which is perhaps the most disorienting sentence in this entire story. The papal endorsement worked on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, it served as a moral clearance certificate. The Victorian period was deeply concerned with the boundary between medicinal and recreational substance use, and the Pope's imprimatur placed Vin Mariani firmly on the medicinal side of that line. Whatever was good enough for the Holy Father was evidently not a vice, was not an indulgence, was not a slippery moral slope toward anything unrespectable. Catholics, who constituted a significant portion of the wine's potential market in France, Italy, Ireland, and the immigrant communities of America, could drink it without spiritual anxiety. The Pope had drunk it. The Pope was fine. At a more sophisticated commercial level, the endorsement served as an argument about what kind of thing Vin Mariani was. In the 1880s, the category of substances that made people feel better was contested territory. It included legitimate pharmaceuticals, fraudulent patent medicines, alcohol dressed up in medical language, and a genuinely uncertain middle ground of preparations that might or might not work depending on the preparation and the person. Mariani needed his product to be perceived as unambiguously legitimate, and nothing communicated legitimacy in Catholic Europe quite as efficiently as the opinion of the Bishop of Rome. The gold medal was displayed in every advertisement. The testimonial was quoted in every catalogue. Mariani may not have been Catholic himself, but he understood the commercial value of sanctification and he used it accordingly. The photograph of Leo XIII that appeared in the Mariani album, the multi-volume collection of celebrity endorsements that Mariani assembled over the years, shows a man in papal white, elderly, serious, and entirely at ease. There is nothing furtive about it, nothing apologetic. He is not concealing anything or qualifying anything. He endorsed the wine as he would endorse a hospital or a charitable organization, straightforwardly, publicly, and with the full weight of his office behind the endorsement. The effect on Mariani's sales was predictable and significant. The effect on the subsequent history of celebrity endorsement as a marketing tool was even more significant, though nobody noticed that part at the time. Mariani was, among his many gifts, a collector, not of art or antiques, but of famous people's opinions of his wine. He began compiling endorsements from notable figures with the systematic enthusiasm of someone building a case for the prosecution, and what he produced over the years was one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of marketing, the Mariani album, a multi-volume collection of signed photographs, written testimonials, and celebrity endorsements from the most famous people on earth. The list reads like a fever dream. Thomas Edison, who needed very little help staying awake but apparently appreciated the assistance, wrote that Vin Mariani allowed him to work longer without fatigue. Ulysses S. Grant, former President of the United States, and a man with complicated feelings about alcohol, nonetheless endorsed the coca wine. Queen Victoria's personal physician noted its benefits. Inventors, explorers, heads of state, novelists, composers and performers all had apparently tried the wine, found it excellent, and were willing to say so in writing while being photographed. The process by which these endorsements were obtained was straightforward and, in its way, rather elegant. Mariani sent bottles of the wine to famous people, accompanied by a polite letter explaining the product and expressing the hope that the recipient would find it useful. This was not a request for an endorsement, at least not explicitly. It was a gift, unsolicited, offered in the spirit of one educated person sharing a useful discovery with another. The famous person drank the wine, experienced its effects, and then, if the effects were what they reliably were, that is to say noticeably positive, wrote back with some expression of appreciation. Mariani collected these expressions, organized them, had photographs taken or solicited, and published the results in volumes of increasing grandeur as the list of contributors expanded. The genius of this approach was that it was not technically a commercial transaction. Nobody was paid. Nobody signed a contract. The famous person had used the product, found it beneficial, and said so freely. This gave the endorsements an authenticity that purchased advertising could never achieve, and it created a dynamic in which the endorsed was complicit in the endorsing in a way that made later withdrawal complicated. If you had publicly stated that Vin Mariani sustained your work as an inventor, or supported your voice as a singer, or helped you maintain your health in old age, then the product's later regulatory difficulties were also, in a small way, your difficulties. The famous people in the Mariani albums were not victims of manipulation. They were participants in a system that benefited everyone while the benefits were running, and nobody's reputation required examining too closely while that was the case. Sarah Bernhardt's endorsement is worth dwelling on because Bernhardt was the most famous performer in the world, and her endorsement therefore carried a specific cultural weight that the popes could not quite match in secular contexts. She was photographed for the album in full theatrical splendor, dark-eyed and formidable, and her written testimonial praised the wine's effect on her stamina and her voice with the directness that was characteristic of her public persona. For a performer who was required to sustain extraordinary physical and emotional output over the course of performances that could last 4 or 5 hours, the appeal of a legal stimulant was both understandable and genuinely functional. Whether the wine improved Bernhardt's actual performances is unknowable. What is certain is that it improved the performances of Mariani's sales figures every time her image appeared in an advertisement, which was frequently and in colour when printing technology permitted. The cumulative effect of the albums was to create something that had not previously existed in commerce, a documented community of famous users whose collective testimony constituted a form of social proof too wide and too distinguished to be dismissed as anecdote. You were not relying on the opinion of one pope or one actor or one inventor. You were relying on the collective judgment of several hundred of the most accomplished people alive, each of whom had independently tried the product and independently found it worth endorsing. The structure of this argument was, in logical terms, genuinely compelling. In commercial terms, it was devastatingly effective. In historical terms, it established every convention of influencer marketing that the 21st century would later develop and claim as its own invention. The literary world of 19th century France was not known for its sobriety, but even by those standards, the embrace of Vin Mariani among writers was enthusiastic to a degree that explains certain creative output. Jules Verne, who managed to write 80 novels in a single lifetime while also managing to imagine submarines, moon rockets, and circumnavigation by balloon, was among the wine's most vocal admirers. His endorsement, written in the florid style that only a Victorian novelist running on coca wine could produce, praised its invigorating properties in terms that read less like a medical review and more like a love letter. Émile Zola, Anatole France, and Alexandre Dumas the Younger were also counted among the wine's supporters. The implication was not subtle. Great literature requires great stimulation, and Mariani had provided both the bottle and the plausible excuse. Whether Verne wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea before or after a glass of the wine is unfortunately unrecorded, but the question is not entirely without relevance. Consider the working conditions of the serious Victorian novelist, because they explain rather a lot about why a product like Vin Mariani would have been appealing to the literary class specifically. The novel as a commercial form required sustained output, at a pace that modern publishing would consider barely adequate and Victorian publishers considered the minimum. Serialization meant producing new chapters on a fixed schedule, week after week or month after month, regardless of inspiration, health, or the general difficulty of having complex feelings about the Industrial Revolution, while also maintaining a household and a social calendar. Dickens wrote at this pace, Zola wrote at this pace, Verne wrote at this pace, and somehow also had time to have opinions about geography. The idea that a glass of wine in the afternoon might make the page easier, the sentences come faster, the imaginative capacity sustain itself through the 6th hour of sitting at a desk. This was not a fantasy. It was an accurate prediction of what cocaine does, at least initially, at least before the dose becomes a negotiation. Zola's work during the period when he was associated with Vin Mariani were some of the most productive of his life. He was writing the Rougon-Macquart cycle, a sequence of 20 novels tracing a single family through 3 generations of French society, with the systematic ambition of someone who had made a plan and intended to execute it regardless of circumstances. That this project required a level of sustained intellectual energy that the average person, and arguably the average novelist, does not naturally possess, is evident from the project's scale. Zola was not drinking the wine to feel good about life. He was drinking it to work, which is a distinction that Victorian society found entirely acceptable and that later decades would examine more carefully. The literary endorsements in the Mariani album were also, from a purely practical standpoint, the most useful kind for the wine's cultural positioning. Medicine could make Vin Mariani legitimate, and the Pope could make it respectable, but literature made it interesting. The suggestion that the wine was part of the creative lives of the century's most celebrated authors gave it an intellectual glamour that straightforward therapeutic claims could never provide. You are not merely taking a tonic for your fatigue. You are participating in the same stimulated clarity that had produced 20,000 Leagues, that had fueled the Rougon-Macquart cycle, that had sustained the creative output of the most dazzling literary generation since the Romantics. That was a more seductive sales proposition than anything Mariani could have constructed from scratch, and the writers had, essentially, constructed it for him by drinking the wine and saying so in print. France loved Vin Mariani, but America was where the real money was, and Mariani understood this with the clarity of a man who just had a glass of his own product. The American patent medicine market of the late 19th century was a landscape of almost theological optimism about chemistry, a world in which any substance presented with enough confidence and in a suitably impressive bottle could be sold as a cure for anything from tuberculosis to melancholy, to the vague but persistent condition of simply feeling like an American in the 1880s. Into this market, Vin Mariani arrived like a candidate running unopposed. Physicians recommended it. Pharmacists displayed it prominently. Newspapers accepted its advertisements. The product was positioned as sophisticated, European, medically respectable. In other words, exactly the opposite of the travelling medicine shows that were peddling their own stimulant concoctions out of painted wagons in county fairgrounds. Vin Mariani had the Pope. It had Thomas Edison. It had a label that implied science and tradition simultaneously. The American consumer was, to use a technical term, extremely interested. The American patent medicine market needs a moment of context, because it is genuinely one of the stranger commercial environments in history. Before federal regulation, before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, any manufacturer could put almost anything in a bottle, claim almost anything on the label, and sell the result through any available retail channel without legal constraint. This freedom produced a market of extraordinary variety, ranging from products that contained exactly what they claimed to contain and did more or less what they claimed to do, to products that contained primarily alcohol, to products that contained substances their manufacturers had not accurately identified, to outright frauds that contained nothing more than coloured water and ambition. Into this undifferentiated field, Vin Mariani stepped with a legitimacy advantage that most of its competitors could not match. It was European, it was physician-endorsed, it was specific about its ingredients, and it actually worked. In a market where many products worked only on the imagination of the consumer, a product that worked on the central nervous system was in a class by itself. The American testimonials for Vin Mariani reflect the particular character of American celebrity culture at the end of the 19th century, which was organised around a slightly different set of heroes than the European version. Where French endorsements lean toward writers and artists, American endorsements lean toward inventors, military figures, and self-made men. The cultural icons of a republic that preferred its heroes to have earned their distinction through work rather than inherited it through birth. Thomas Edison was the American celebrity par excellence, the self-made genius, the relentless worker, the man who stayed awake longer than anyone else and emerged with the electric light. His endorsement of a product that he found helped him work longer was, in the context of American values at the time, almost the highest possible recommendation. Edison said it helped him work. In an America that worshipped work, nothing more needed to be said. Ulysses Grant's endorsement is, in retrospect, perhaps the most poignant item in the American section of the Mariani catalogue. Grant had a complicated relationship with alcohol that had followed him from the Civil War through his presidency and beyond, and by the time he was endorsing Vin Mariani, he was dying of throat cancer, racing against a deadline both medical and literary to finish his memoirs before the disease finished him. He dictated and wrote at a pace that his physicians found alarming and his publishers found heroic, and the coca wine was among the preparations he used to sustain the effort. His memoirs, finished days before his death in 1885, are considered among the finest military memoirs in American literature. Whether the wine made them better is impossible to say. What is certain is that Grant finished them, which is more than most dying men manage, and that Vin Mariani was on his desk while he did. The story of Vin Mariani cannot be told without pausing on what happened when it crossed the Atlantic and caught the attention of an Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton, because what Pemberton did next was either a stroke of genius, an act of imitation so thorough it verged on plagiarism, or simply the inevitable result of showing a 19th century chemist a successful product and leaving him alone in a laboratory. Pemberton had already been experimenting with coca-based tonics when he encountered Mariani's wine, and its commercial success clearly impressed him. His initial product, Pemberton's French wine coca, was transparently modelled on Vin Mariani, a coca leaf preparation dissolved in wine, marketed as a stimulating health drink and positioned for the same affluent, health-anxious consumer. It sold well, and then in 1886, Fulton County in Georgia went dry under local prohibition laws, which created a problem for a wine-based product and an opportunity for a soft drink, and Pemberton reformulated his recipe without the wine, added carbonated water, adjusted the sweetener, and called the result Coca-Cola, a name that preserved in its first syllable the direct lineage from Mariani's original idea. The details of Pemberton's reformulation are, from a purely chemical standpoint, interesting. He needed to replace the wine, both as a solvent for the coca leaf extract and as a flavour component, and he needed to replace the particular kind of mild intoxication that alcohol provided, which had been part of the product's appeal. He chose carbonated water, which provides its own kind of mild stimulation, and he added other flavouring ingredients, oils of orange, lemon, nutmeg, coriander, neroli, and cinnamon, along with caramel for colour and phosphoric acid for tartness, that combined with the coca extract to produce a flavour profile that was genuinely distinctive and genuinely pleasurable. The original Coca-Cola also contained caffeine from cola nuts, which is the second syllable of the name, and together the cocaine and caffeine produced a stimulant combination that worked briskly and was, by all contemporary accounts, extremely enjoyable. Pemberton sold the rights to his formula before he fully understood what he had made. He was ill, financially troubled, and did not live to see the company become what it became. He died in 1888, 2 years after the first Coca-Cola was sold in Atlanta. The businessmen who bought the rights from him, Asa Griggs Candler primarily, recognized the commercial potential and built the distribution infrastructure, the bottling network, and the advertising empire that turned a drugstore syrup into a global brand. They did not, in the early years, modify the formula significantly. The cocaine remained. The drink contained measurable amounts of cocaine until approximately 1900, when the company, under increasing pressure from the regulatory and moral environment that was beginning to form around stimulant products, began reducing and eventually eliminating the cocaine content while retaining the decocainized coca leaf extract for flavor. The relationship between Vin Mariani and Coca-Cola is, therefore, not metaphorical or thematic. It is chemical and commercial, a direct line from Mariani's Corsican laboratory to Pemberton's Atlanta drugstore to the most successful beverage brand in human history. When you drink a Coca-Cola, and statistically, if you're alive in the 21st century, you have drunk a Coca-Cola, you are drinking the extremely distant descendant of a cocaine wine that a 19th century pope found helpful for the demands of his papal duties. This is either the most extraordinary footnote in the history of consumer products or a completely adequate explanation for why the drink has always felt slightly more compelling than it should. Possibly both. Victorian medicine's response to Vin Mariani was less a unified position and more a spectrum ranging from enthusiastic endorsement to polite concern, to the kind of professional silence that means people are using the product privately while recommending it publicly with caveats. Physicians of the era had several legitimate reasons to find cocaine therapeutically interesting. It was, in fact, a genuine local anesthetic. Carl Koller had demonstrated this for ophthalmological surgery in 1884, and the medical applications were real and significant. Sigmund Freud had published his famous monograph on coca in the same year, arguing for its benefits in treating morphine addiction, fatigue, and depression, with the kind of confident specificity that would later cause him considerable embarrassment. Against this backdrop, a coca-infused wine seemed less like a vice and more like a delivery mechanism for an interesting new class of medicine. The dose was relatively controlled, the vehicle was socially respectable, and the effects were, at least in the short term, clearly positive. What the medical establishment was less equipped to discuss was dependence. The concept of addiction as a physiological process was poorly understood, and the particular seductiveness of stimulants, the way they work magnificently until they don't, was not yet in the medical vocabulary in any useful form. The medical journals of the 1870s and 80s contain a fascinating archive of the profession's encounter with cocaine, and reading them now is an exercise in watching intelligence grapple with a problem it does not yet have the tools to solve. The reports are careful, observational, and largely positive. Physicians noted that cocaine relieved fatigue, improved mood, suppressed appetite, and was particularly useful in cases of exhaustion associated with recovery from serious illness. They noted that patients found it pleasant, that they returned for it willingly, that their condition appeared to improve during the course of treatment. What the reports did not yet contain, because the cases had not yet accumulated in sufficient numbers, because the time frame of observation was too short, because the concept of addiction did not yet exist in its modern form, was the observation that the patients who returned willingly were doing so not only because they were getting better, but because the substance had made their baseline worse in its absence. The physicians who did observe warning signs in the 1880s and 90s faced a structural problem in communicating them. The medical establishment had endorsed cocaine enthusiastically, including in the pages of the journals in which any skeptical report would have to appear. Challenging the consensus was professionally costly. The product had the Pope's endorsement, Thomas Edison's endorsement, and the endorsement of the pharmaceutical firms that were by now producing cocaine at industrial scale. A physician who wrote that he had noticed patients becoming unable to function without Vin Mariani was not merely making a clinical observation. He was challenging a consensus supported by the most powerful commercial and cultural interests in the world of medicine, and he was doing so without the conceptual framework: addiction, dependence, withdrawal. That would have given his observation its proper weight. The one area where the medical establishment found it easier to raise concerns was in the context of class and race, which tells you something uncomfortable about the limits of Victorian medical ethics. Concerns about cocaine were expressed most freely when cocaine was associated with the working class, with immigrants, with black Americans in the South, with the poor. The wine-drinking bourgeoisie who used Vin Mariani under medical recommendation were coded as patients. The workers who chewed coca or used cheaper cocaine preparations were coded as a social problem. The medicine was the same substance, producing the same effects in the same bodies. The difference was who was doing the using and what that meant to the people doing the worrying. The advertising for Vin Mariani was careful to include women prominently, which tells you something both about the product's marketing strategy and about the particular anxieties of Victorian womanhood that the wine was positioned to address. Neurasthenia, that elastic 19th century diagnosis for nervous exhaustion, was diagnosed in women at a rate that suggests it was doing significant work as a catch-all for the symptoms of a life constrained by corsets, social expectation, limited autonomy, and the physical demands of frequent childbearing. Women were prescribed tonics, rest cures, and various preparations that, viewed from the present, look less like medicine and more like the management of inconvenient personhood. Into this context, Vin Mariani arrived as a physician, endorsed, socially acceptable, genuinely effective means of feeling temporarily better about everything. It gave energy, suppressed appetite, elevated mood, and required no prescription, only the cost of the bottle. That women used it enthusiastically is neither surprising nor difficult to understand. That it was sold to them as medicine rather than pleasure is the part of the story that takes on a certain irony with distance. The diagnosis of neurasthenia was, in the 1880s, almost a fashion accessory for the middle-class woman, not in the sense that it was trivial, but in the sense that it was nearly universal. The condition was described by the American neurologist George Beard, who coined the term in 1869 as a depletion of nervous energy caused by the excessive demands of modern civilization. Beard was genuinely trying to describe something real, the particular combination of fatigue, anxiety, depression, physical symptoms, and loss of capacity that characterized a significant proportion of his patients. But the diagnosis he created was so broad that it could contain almost anything, and in practice it did. A Victorian woman who was exhausted from managing a household, nursing an infant, managing servants, maintaining a social calendar, and suppressing any emotional response not sanctioned by contemporary expectations of femininity, was a neurasthenic. So was a woman grieving a lost child, a woman in a miserable marriage, a woman whose intellectual life had been reduced to embroidery and charitable visiting by the limits of her social position. Neurasthenia was what happened when a human being's circumstances exceeded their capacity, and there was no socially acceptable explanation for why. Into this diagnosis, Vin Mariani arrived as a treatment that worked in exactly the way a stimulant works on someone who is genuinely exhausted. It restored the energy that the circumstances kept removing. The woman who had felt incapable of managing the afternoon felt, after a glass of the wine, capable again. Her mood lifted. Her appetite for engaging with the world, with her children, with her social obligations recovered. She was better, genuinely, functionally better, for as long as the wine was working. That the next afternoon arrived with the same exhaustion, requiring another glass, producing another recovery, generating a pattern that was sustainable until it wasn't. This was not part of the conversation. The treatment worked. Returning for more of a treatment that worked was not, in the medical understanding of the time, a warning sign. It was compliance. The women in Mariani's advertising, and there were many of them, rendered in the tasteful illustration style of the period, were not depicted as ill. They were depicted as vibrant, socially engaged, equal to their obligations. They were not taking medicine. They were maintaining their vitality, which was a different and considerably more flattering framing. Vitality was something a woman of the period could aspire to without embarrassment. Illness was something to be concealed. Vin Mariani was sold as a means of maintaining the former rather than treating the latter, and this distinction, purely rhetorical though it was, made the product accessible to women who would not have sought a physician's prescription for exhaustion, but who would very readily have purchased, in a pharmacy, a bottle of something that promised to keep them equal to the day. Long before any modern celebrity signed a contract to appear in a soft drink advertisement, Angelo Mariani had built the entire infrastructure of the transaction. His method was deceptively simple. He sent bottles of his wine to famous people, waited for responses, and then published those responses in beautifully produced catalogues that he distributed free of charge to physicians, pharmacists, and the general reading public. The genius was in the selection. Mariani did not pursue any famous person randomly. He targeted figures whose endorsement would carry specific weight in specific markets. Scientists for the scientifically minded, artists for the culturally aspirational, heads of state for the political class, and clerics for anyone who still worried about the propriety of enjoying a stimulant. He understood, decades before the discipline of marketing had a name, that people do not buy products so much as they buy membership in the group of people who use those products. If you drank Vin Mariani, you were, in some small way, drinking what the Pope drank, what Thomas Edison drank, what Jules Verne drank. You were, in the particular currency of the 19th century, cosmopolitan. The scale of the operation was considerable. Mariani employed a staff of correspondents who managed the outgoing sample shipments and the incoming testimonial responses, organized the photographs, and coordinated the production of the albums. The albums themselves were printed to a standard of quality that placed them firmly in the category of reference works rather than advertising brochures. Large format, quality paper, careful typography, the kind of object that a physician might keep on a shelf and consult, rather than glance at and discard. They were sent to medical schools, to hospitals, to the offices of prominent practitioners, to clubs and societies where the professional class gathered. They were in effect peer-reviewed literature in the sense that the reviewers were the peers of the potential consumer, not scientists reviewing data, but famous people reviewing an experience, which was a form of evidence that the Victorian mind found entirely compelling. What Mariani had discovered, without articulating it in these terms, was the mechanism of social proof, the tendency of human beings to look to the behaviour of others, particularly admired others, as evidence of what is correct or desirable or safe. This mechanism was not new in the 1860s, but it had not previously been systematically deployed in the service of a consumer product at this scale. Royalty had endorsed products informally throughout European commercial history. The phrase "by appointment to Her Majesty" on a tin of biscuits was doing similar work. But Mariani's approach was more comprehensive, more documented, more global, and more explicitly testimonial. He was not suggesting that the famous person used the product. He was providing, in the person's own handwriting, a statement that they used it and what the experience had been. This is not an incremental improvement on the by-appointment model. It is a different model entirely, and it is the one that has dominated consumer marketing in every medium since. The economic logic of the system was subtle but powerful. Mariani spent money on wine and postage, and in return received testimonials that functioned as advertising without being classifiable as advertising. They were, in legal terms, private correspondence made public, not promotional material created by the manufacturer. The famous endorser had no commercial relationship with Mariani in any formal sense. They had simply received a gift, found it excellent, and said so. This distinction protected the credibility of the testimonials in a way that paid advertising could never achieve, and it established the principle, exploited to its fullest extent a century later in the form of social media influencers, that the most valuable endorsement is the one that does not appear to be an endorsement at all. Mariani's success was predictably intoxicating to other entrepreneurs, and within a decade of the wine's launch, the market had filled with competitors ranging from the earnest to the outright fraudulent. Some were genuinely similar products, coca leaf wines of varying quality and cocaine content, produced by pharmacists who had correctly identified the commercial opportunity and correctly identified that the regulatory environment made it available to anyone with a wine merchant and a supplier of dried leaves. Others were more creative interpretations: coca lozenges, coca tonics, coca cigarettes, coca tooth powder, and at least one documented attempt at a coca suppository that we will leave uncommented on out of respect for everyone involved. The sheer variety of coca-based products available to the Victorian consumer in the 1880s and 90s was remarkable, and they operated in a legal and medical grey zone that the regulatory frameworks of the time were entirely unequipped to address. There was no Food and Drug Administration. There was no controlled substances schedule. There was only the market, and the market thought cocaine was extremely good for you. The quality differential between Vin Mariani and its competitors was real and significant, and Mariani was not modest about pointing this out. His advertisements frequently made implicit or explicit comparisons between his carefully produced pharmacist-grade preparation and the lesser products that were trading on the reputation of coca without the substance. He had the Mariani albums, the papal endorsement, the testimonials from recognizable names. His competitors had labels that said coca wine and a prayer. In a market where consumer protection did not exist, the reputation differential between the premium product and the imitation was the primary quality signal available to the buyer, and Mariani had spent 30 years building the most valuable reputation in the sector. This was a moat that was difficult to cross, which is why the competitors generally tried to go around it, by targeting different price points, different geographic markets, or different use cases, rather than challenging it directly. The British market produced its own coca wine tradition, partly inspired by Vin Mariani and partly arising from the indigenous patent medicine culture that had been flourishing in Britain since the 18th century. British coca wines were generally less sophisticated in their formulation and less ambitious in their marketing than Mariani's product, but they were considerably cheaper and available in a wider range of retail environments. Chemist shops in Victorian Britain carried coca preparations as a matter of course, alongside morphine, laudanum, and various other substances that the contemporary reader will find alarming, and the Victorian reader found entirely unremarkable. The distinction between the legitimate medical preparation and the dubious patent nostrum was, in practice, largely a matter of price and packaging rather than chemistry or regulation, which meant that the consumer was navigating a landscape without reliable maps. The German pharmaceutical industry, Merck of Darmstadt being the primary actor, took a different approach entirely, choosing to produce pure cocaine hydrochloride in quantity rather than coca leaf preparations in wine. German pharmaceutical cocaine was precise, consistent, and marketed primarily to the medical profession, rather than to consumers directly. It supplied the operating theatres where cocaine was used as a local anaesthetic, the medical practices where it was prescribed for various conditions, and, inevitably, the broader market of people who preferred their stimulants without the wine. The availability of pharmaceutical-grade pure cocaine through legitimate medical channels meant that by the 1890s, cocaine was not only in bottles of Vin Mariani and its competitors, it was in the medicine cabinet, in the surgery, in the dentist's chair, and in the hands of a significant and growing number of people who had started with one of these legitimate uses and continued past it. The Mariani albums were, in their physical form, genuinely beautiful objects, large format volumes printed on quality paper, bound in cloth, featuring reproductions of signed photographs from the wine's most famous endorsers alongside their written testimonials, often decorated with ornate borders and the occasional illustration. Mariani produced multiple volumes over the years as the celebrity list expanded, and they were distributed not as catalogues but as gifts, objects of sufficient quality that a physician or notable person could display them without embarrassment. The photographs themselves are remarkable as historical documents. Here is Sarah Bernhardt, the most famous actress in the world, looking directly at the camera with the particular intensity of a woman who has found something that works. Here is a cardinal. Here is an inventor. Here is a general. All of them connected in this strange archive by a shared experience and a shared willingness to put their name to it. The albums were sent to physicians as educational material. They were displayed in pharmacies. They were collected. They were, in their quiet way, one of the most effective sustained advertising campaigns in the history of consumer products, and they established every technique that modern influencer marketing would later rediscover and claim as new. Reading the testimonials in the albums today is an experience that requires a certain suspension of temporal judgment, because they were written without irony, without concealment, and without any apparent awareness that future readers would find them extraordinary. Edison writes as a man describing a useful tool, the same matter-of-fact tone in which he might describe a new insulating material or an improved filament design. Grant writes as a soldier making a practical recommendation. The Pope writes as a spiritual leader acknowledging a gift for which he is grateful. The opera singers write as professionals, noting a benefit to their professional capacity. None of them are writing, or appear to be writing, as salespeople. They are writing as users, and the authenticity of the user perspective is precisely what makes the album such an effective commercial document and such a peculiar historical one. The visual design of the albums deserves attention because it was not accidental. Mariani employed illustrators as well as photographers, and the albums contain original artwork commissioned specifically for the publications. Ornate borders featuring the coca plant, allegorical figures representing health and vitality, portraits rendered in the engraving style of the scientific illustration. This gave the albums the visual language of scientific and medical publications rather than commercial advertising, which reinforced the positioning of Vin Mariani as a pharmaceutical product rather than a consumer indulgence. You were not reading a catalogue. You were reading a medical reference work that happened to have been produced by the manufacturer, which is a distinction that the rational mind sees through, but the emotional mind tends to accept, particularly when the reference work is beautifully made and the endorsers include the Pope. The distribution strategy for the albums was as carefully considered as their production. They went to physicians, to medical schools, to pharmacies, to clubs and learned societies. They went to newspaper offices, where editors who received a beautifully produced volume of testimonials from the most famous people in the world were somewhat more likely to publish favourable mentions of the product than editors who had not. They went to the homes of notable people who might become endorsers themselves, priming the conversation about what the wine was and who used it before the bottle arrived. The albums were, in modern terms, a content marketing operation of considerable sophistication, not advertising, but the creation and distribution of material that created the cultural context in which advertising could be effective. Mariani understood that you did not sell a product by telling people to buy it. You sold it by making it part of the world they already wanted to inhabit. The conditions for which Vin Mariani was prescribed, fatigue, melancholy, nervous exhaustion, loss of appetite, convalescence from illness, were real conditions, and the wine's effects on them were real effects. Cocaine is a genuine central nervous system stimulant, and its short-term results in a malnourished, overworked, or depressed person are measurably positive. Increased energy, improved mood, reduced perception of pain and fatigue, elevated sense of capacity and optimism. For a Victorian who had just survived a long illness and could not eat, whose appetite had collapsed along with their weight and their ability to engage with the world, a bottle of Vin Mariani was not nothing. It worked. The problem was not that it worked. The problem was that it worked in a way that created demand for more of it, that its benefits were front-loaded and its costs were back-loaded, and that the 19th century had no framework for understanding the difference between a medicine that cured a condition and a substance that managed the symptoms of its own absence. The wine was genuinely helpful in the short term and genuinely problematic in the long term, and the short term was the only term that 19th century medicine was really measuring. The specific conditions for which Vin Mariani was most useful map almost perfectly onto the conditions in which stimulants are genuinely effective, which is to say, conditions of genuine exhaustion, depleted energy reserves, and reduced motivational capacity. A patient recovering from typhoid fever, who's lost significant weight, who has spent weeks in bed, and who cannot summon the energy to eat, will genuinely benefit from a substance that restores appetite and energy. A working woman managing chronic fatigue in a life with no structural accommodation for rest genuinely benefits from something that makes the afternoon manageable. A dying general writing his memoirs against a deadline that is also a terminal prognosis genuinely benefits from something that extends his working hours. In each of these cases, the benefit is real. The question that the 19th century was not yet asking was, what happens after the acute condition resolves if the use continues? The answer is what pharmacologists now understand as tolerance and dependence. With repeated use, the brain adjusts its own chemistry to compensate for the presence of cocaine, producing less of the neurotransmitters that cocaine amplifies, and requiring the cocaine to maintain what has become the new baseline. The dose that once elevated mood now merely prevents its depression. The dose that once restored energy now merely prevents the exhaustion that its absence produces. The user who began taking the wine to treat a real condition is now taking it to prevent the symptoms of not taking it, which are indistinguishable, subjectively, from a return of the original condition. From inside this experience, the rational conclusion is that the treatment is working and must be continued. From outside, the conclusion is more complicated. Victorian physicians who observed this pattern in their patients were not, for the most part, alarmed in the way that a physician in any subsequent decade would be, because the concept of dependence was not yet organized in their clinical thinking. What they observed was a patient who improved with treatment and relapsed without it, a pattern that was consistent with, and in most cases indistinguishable from, a genuine recurrence of the underlying condition. The wine had treated the neurasthenia. Without the wine, the neurasthenia returned. The conclusion that more wine was needed was medically coherent given the framework available. It was also, in retrospect, precisely wrong, in the particular way that medical conclusions can be precisely wrong when the framework is incomplete. Beyond its medical applications, Vin Mariani had a social life, and that social life was entirely consistent with its effects. It appeared on dinner tables in Paris, London, New York, and Vienna. It was served at literary salons and after concert gatherings. It was present at the kind of events where ideas were exchanged and ambitions were announced, and the evening seemed to promise everything, and the wine helped sustain the feeling that everything might actually be delivered. The aristocracy drank it, the intelligentsia drank it, the newly wealthy middle class drank it because the aristocracy and the intelligentsia did, which is why the middle class has always done anything. It was fashionable in the precise sense that the word meant something in the 19th century, not merely popular, but identified with a particular kind of cultured, forward-looking, medically sophisticated person who understood that science had improved upon nature and that improvement came in a bottle. To drink Vin Mariani in a Paris salon in 1885 was to signal something, that you were serious, modern, well-connected, and probably about to have a very good second half of the evening. The dinner party as a Victorian institution was precisely the social environment in which Vin Mariani's effects were most perfectly displayed. A stimulant that elevates mood, sharpens conversational capacity, increases the sense of energy and engagement, and suppresses appetite enough to sustain interest in the proceedings rather than the food. This is a substance designed as if deliberately for the demands of a Victorian dinner table. You were wittier. You were more present in the conversation. You followed the thread of an argument with unusual precision and returned to it across 3 courses without losing it. You laughed at the right moments and made others laugh at the right moments, and the evening felt in the particular register that hosts value and guests remember, exceptional. The fact that the exceptionality was chemically assisted was not, in this context, a moral problem. It was, if anything, a recommendation. The salons of Paris in the 1870s and 80s were the intellectual nerve centres of a civilization that took its intellectual life seriously, and Vin Mariani was present in them the way good wine is always present in environments where conversation matters, not incidentally but functionally, as a social lubricant with specific properties suited to the demands of the occasion. The philosopher who found that the wine helped him articulate a position he had been struggling with for months was not imagining the benefit. The novelist who found that the 4th hour of a conversation produced more usable material than the first, partly because the wine had sustained the energy, and partly because the conversation had reached the depth where interesting things are said. This was also a real observation. The social life of Vin Mariani was not separate from its pharmacological life. It was an expression of it, in the particular social environments where a specific kind of stimulation produced a specific kind of benefit. The class dimension of this social life deserves a direct observation. The wine that was doing these things in Parisian salons was also doing broadly similar things in rather less rarefied environments, in the cafes and working-class tonic shops where cheaper coca preparations were available at lower price points. The effects were comparable. The social coding was entirely different. The bourgeois who drank Vin Mariani at dinner was taking a medical tonic of distinguished provenance. The worker who consumed a cheaper coca preparation at a cafe counter was, in the eyes of the social observers who were beginning to categorize these behaviors in the 1890s, a social problem in formation. The chemistry did not distinguish between them. The sociology did. The temperance movement, which by the 1880s was a significant social and political force on both sides of the Atlantic, faced a particular difficulty with Vin Mariani, and that difficulty was essentially logical in nature. The movement's objection was to alcohol, specifically to the social destruction wrought by heavy drinking, the ruined families and wasted wages and general misery that unregulated access to spirits had produced in industrial society. Vin Mariani was technically wine. It was therefore a target, but it was also physician-recommended, Pope-endorsed, and widely regarded as a medicine rather than an indulgence, which gave it a protective camouflage that harder spirits lacked. Temperance advocates who attacked Vin Mariani risked appearing to attack medicine, to be against health, to oppose the judgment of both the medical establishment and the Holy See. This was not a comfortable position. The result was a kind of rhetorical awkwardness, in which the product's cocaine content, which by any later standard was the more alarming component, went largely unremarked, while its modest wine base attracted the most public criticism, which tells you something important about which substances Victorian society had already decided to fear and which it had not yet learned to recognize. The temperance movement in America was, by the 1880s, organized around a moral and social argument that has been refined across several decades of activism. The argument was simple, empirically grounded in the observable consequences of alcohol abuse in industrial communities, and emotionally compelling. Spirits destroyed families, impoverished the working class, corrupted the political process through the saloon system, and produced suffering on a scale that no civilized society should tolerate. This argument had considerable power, and it would eventually produce the 18th Amendment. But it was an argument about alcohol, and it had no ready vocabulary for cocaine, a substance that was not only legal but medically endorsed, that was sold not in saloons but in pharmacies, that was consumed not by the dissolute poor but by the educated professional class, and that produced not the visible, dramatic, socially destructive intoxication of drunkenness, but a quiet, energized, functional state that looked, to the outside observer, like the opposite of impairment. Some temperance advocates made the logical extension and argued against all mind-altering substances, but this position was difficult to maintain in a culture that embedded wine in its religious practice, coffee in its commercial culture, and cocaine in its medicine cabinet. The specific temperance position that alcohol was the problem and its elimination was the solution was structurally ill-equipped to address a substance that arrived in an alcohol-based vehicle, but whose primary active ingredient was something else entirely. The movement attacked the wine. It largely did not attack the coca. And in the years when temperance was winning its political battles, when local option laws were passing, when state-level prohibition was spreading, the response of cocaine wine manufacturers was, in many cases, simply to reformulate without the alcohol, which is exactly what Pemberton did when he turned his French wine coca into Coca-Cola. The temperance movement helped create the soft drink industry by forcing the reformulation of the products it objected to, which is one of those historical ironies that is too neat to have been deliberately designed. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, one of the most effective reform organizations of the period, did eventually expand its critique beyond alcohol to include narcotics and stimulants more broadly. But this expansion came slowly and was less coherent than the core anti-alcohol message. By the time the WCTU was making arguments about cocaine, the medical establishment had already begun the slow process of revising its position. The first federal regulatory frameworks were being constructed, and Vin Mariani was already beginning its retreat from the market that its own success had helped build. The late 19th century was, in its particular way, obsessed with optimization, with the idea that the right diet, the right exercise, the right air, the right substance could make a person more than they were, could unlock capacity and productivity and longevity in ways that the previous generation had not had access to. Vin Mariani arrived directly into this preoccupation and spoke to it fluently. Its marketing positioned the wine not as an escape from ordinary life, but as an enhancement of ordinary life, something that made work easier, thought clearer, and the evening more pleasurable without any of the social stigma attached to harder forms of intoxication. This was the genius of Mariani's framing. The wine was not for people who wanted to feel less. It was for people who wanted to feel more energetic, more creative, more equal to the demands of a modern world that was accelerating in every direction. Edison used it to work longer. Grant used it to write his memoirs against a terminal cancer diagnosis. Bernhardt used it to perform 2 shows in an evening. These were not people escaping their lives. These were people running faster through them, with chemical assistance, which the 19th century considered a perfectly respectable thing to do. The culture of self-improvement in the Victorian era was organized around several competing, but not entirely incompatible frameworks. The religious framework, that improvement was a moral duty, that the body was a temple, that discipline and self-control were the highest expressions of Christian virtue, sat uneasily alongside the scientific framework, which suggested that the body was a mechanism, and that mechanisms could be maintained and enhanced through the application of the right inputs. Vin Mariani navigated this tension with considerable skill. It was medical, which placed it on the scientific side of the ledger. It was endorsed by the Pope, which placed it on the religious side. It was produced in France, which placed it on the cultural side. And it worked, which placed it on the practical side that all the other sides eventually deferred to. The concept of productivity, which is so central to modern professional culture that it has become difficult to imagine thinking without it, was being consolidated as a value in the Victorian period. The Industrial Revolution had introduced the idea of output per unit time as a meaningful measure of human worth, and the emerging professional and commercial classes had internalized this measure in ways that their agricultural predecessors had not quite managed. If you could produce more, write more, invent more, manage more, perform more, you were more valuable, more successful, more worthy of the social position you occupied. A substance that increased productive capacity was therefore not merely a pleasurable indulgence. It was an investment in your own productive value, a rational allocation of resources toward the goal of becoming more of what a modern society rewarded. This framing made the use of Vin Mariani not just acceptable, but in certain social contexts virtually obligatory. You were not enjoying yourself, you were optimizing. The parallel with contemporary productivity culture is close enough to be uncomfortable. The professional who microdoses a stimulant to improve focus, the executive who tracks sleep, diet, and cognitive performance with the systematic attention of an engineer monitoring a machine, the worker who consumes caffeine strategically rather than pleasurably. All of these are expressions of the same underlying framework that made Vin Mariani a respectable professional tool in the 1880s. The substance has changed. The schedule has changed. The regulatory environment has changed enormously. The fundamental desire to be more productive, more capable, more equal to the demands of a society that measures you by your output has not changed at all. The doubts arrived slowly and from unexpected directions. They came not primarily from the temperance movement or from moral reformers, but from physicians who were beginning to observe, in their practices, a pattern that did not fit the therapeutic model. Patients who had been prescribed Vin Mariani for a short course of treatment were requesting more of it after the original condition had resolved. Patients who had stopped taking it were reporting a collapse of energy and mood that seemed disproportionate to their underlying illness. The word that began appearing in medical literature with increasing frequency was habituation, a polite term for what later decades would call addiction, describing a condition in which the body had adjusted to the presence of the substance and now required it to function at normal baseline levels. The dose that had once produced elevation now merely prevented the opposite. This pattern was not unique to Vin Mariani. It was appearing across the broader landscape of cocaine use in the 1890s as the substance moved from medical curiosity to widespread consumer product. But the wine was where many people had first encountered cocaine, and the wine was where the pattern was first widely observed. The medical case reports that document these early observations are, reading them now, almost painfully recognizable. A physician in Paris describes a patient, male, middle-aged, prosperous, who was prescribed Vin Mariani for convalescence following a respiratory illness. The patient recovered and resumed his professional activities, continuing to take the wine on his physician's recommendation as a maintenance preparation. Over a period of 18 months, the physician notes, the patient's dose has increased. He now requires 2 glasses where 1 was previously sufficient. On the occasion when he attempted to stop the wine, at his physician's suggestion, as an experiment, he experienced 3 days of profound exhaustion, lowered mood, and inability to concentrate, followed by a return to relatively normal function. The physician concludes that the patient's constitution has adapted to the preparation and that cautious reduction is advisable. He does not use the word addiction. The concept does not yet exist in a form he can apply. This particular kind of not seeing is worth dwelling on, because it is not the result of stupidity or negligence, but of the genuine absence of a conceptual tool. The physician observing this patient sees the symptoms accurately. He records the increased dose. He notices the withdrawal-like response. He recommends reduction. What he lacks is the framework that would allow him to name what he is seeing, to categorize it as a pharmacological phenomenon rather than an individual constitutional peculiarity, to connect it to similar cases in other patients and other practices, and recognize the pattern as systemic. That framework was being built in the 1890s from exactly these kinds of individual observations. But the building took time, and in the meantime, the wine kept selling and the dose kept climbing and the patients kept returning. The physicians who published the first explicit concerns about cocaine habituation in the early 1890s faced significant professional headwinds. The product had the medical establishment's endorsement. It had the Pope's endorsement. The pharmaceutical firms producing cocaine were among the most powerful commercial entities in the healthcare sector. The journals in which the concerns needed to be published were supported by advertising from pharmaceutical manufacturers. The social cost of being the physician who said that cocaine was not what it seemed, in a professional environment that had spent 30 years insisting it was exactly what it seemed, was considerable, and not every physician who saw the pattern was willing to pay it. No account of cocaine's 19th century career is complete without Sigmund Freud, who occupies in this story the position of the brilliant and enthusiastic early adopter, who got things comprehensively wrong in ways that would take decades to fully appreciate. Freud's 1884 paper on coca was a genuine attempt at scientific evaluation of cocaine's properties, and it correctly identified several of them: the stimulant effect, the local anesthetic property, the mood elevation, the appetite suppression. Where it failed catastrophically in hindsight was in its treatment of dependence. Freud prescribed cocaine to a colleague to treat morphine addiction, a recommendation based on the logical but incorrect premise that replacing one addictive substance with another that seemed more benign constituted a cure. The colleague developed a severe cocaine problem. Freud, to his considerable later regret, had to acknowledge this publicly. His own personal use of cocaine, which he documented in his letters with an intimacy that is both revealing and uncomfortable, followed the pattern that his medical writings had failed to predict. Initial enthusiasm, apparent benefits, escalating use, gradual recognition of the costs. He eventually stopped, which is more than can be said for everyone who had followed his recommendation. Freud's relationship with cocaine is one of the more human episodes in the history of a figure who is otherwise remembered in rather larger-than-life terms. He began using it in 1884 at the age of 28, and his letters from this period have the quality of someone describing a discovery of genuine importance, which is how it felt, because it was. Cocaine relieved his depression, his fatigue, his social anxiety. It made the work easier. It made the evenings better. He sent it to his fiancée Martha, recommending it for her own well-being. He wrote a scientific paper about it in the hopeful, expansive register of a researcher who believes he has found something important and wants to share it before anyone else does. The paper got several things right. It got the fundamental thing: whether this substance was safe for regular use, catastrophically wrong. The colleague was Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, a brilliant physiologist and a friend whom Freud genuinely cared about, who was suffering from morphine addiction following a hand injury that required repeated operations. Freud recommended cocaine as a treatment for the morphine addiction, and Fleischl-Marxow's case became one of the first documented examples of cocaine dependence in the medical literature. Not that it was recognized as such at the time. Fleischl-Marxow went from morphine dependence to cocaine dependence, with the cocaine producing effects that the morphine had not: paranoia, hallucinations, and eventual diagnosis of cocaine psychosis. He died in 1891, 7 years after Freud's recommendation, in circumstances that Freud carried as a source of guilt for the rest of his life. Freud's own cocaine use tapered off gradually through the late 1880s and into the 90s as he began to understand, through both clinical observation and personal experience, that the substance's long-term profile was not what he had initially believed. He never publicly recanted his original paper with the completeness that its errors warranted, which was a professional failure that his critics noted and his defenders explained variously. What he did do more usefully, was redirect his intellectual energy toward understanding the mind through other means. The talking cure, the interpretation of dreams, the development of psychoanalysis, that owed something, if only negatively, to his cocaine period. The episode with cocaine convinced Freud that the quick chemical intervention was not the solution to psychological suffering that it appeared to be, which pushed him toward the slower, more laborious approach that became his professional legacy. By the 1890s, cocaine was not merely a Parisian curiosity or an American patent medicine ingredient. It was a global phenomenon, and Vin Mariani had been one of the primary vehicles of its introduction to the respectable consumer class across multiple continents. The British Empire spread it through its medical networks. German pharmaceutical companies, Merck of Darmstadt most notably, were producing pharmaceutical-grade cocaine at industrial scale. American physicians were administering it in surgery, in dentistry, in the treatment of hay fever. It was in throat lozenges, in nasal sprays, in cigarettes marketed for respiratory complaints. The coca leaf extract was in Vin Mariani in France, in Coca-Cola in America, in coca wine variants across Britain and its colonies. What had been a sacred plant used carefully by Andean communities for millennia had, in the space of approximately 3 decades, been extracted, refined, dissolved into wine and syrup and patent medicine, and distributed globally at a price accessible to the urban middle class. The century that had begun with cocaine as a pharmacological unknown ended with it in the medicine cabinet of a significant portion of the industrialized world. The speed of this global spread was enabled by the intersection of several forces that were themselves products of the same period of accelerating modernity that Vin Mariani had been designed to serve. The railway and the steamship had made global distribution of physical goods practical at a scale that was not possible before. The illustrated press and the telegraph had made global communication of ideas and endorsements possible at a speed that was not possible before. The professional medical networks of the European empires, the colonial medical services, the missionary hospitals, the military medical corps, spread pharmaceutical practices along with their practitioners into every part of the world that European power touched. And European power in the 1880s and 90s touched a very large part of the world. British India was an early and significant market. The colonial medical establishment in India was interested in cocaine for its anesthetic properties, a legitimate and important application, and this legitimate interest provided the entry point for broader distribution. The same networks that brought surgical cocaine to Bombay brought Vin Mariani to the drawing rooms of the colonial administrator class, which in the particular social geography of British India occupied a position of cultural authority similar to the Parisian salon. The endorsement machinery that Mariani had built in Europe was replicated informally through the correspondence and social networks of the expatriate British professional class, for whom a product endorsed by Thomas Edison and Pope Leo X was considerably more trustworthy than the local patent medicine alternatives. The Latin American trajectory is particularly striking given the plant's origins. Peru and Bolivia, the primary sources of coca leaves, had exported the raw material to Europe for processing, and then imported the processed product, in the form of Vin Mariani and its competitors, at a markup that tells you something important about the economics of colonial-era commodity trade. The people who had grown the plant, who had understood its properties for 8,000 years, who had managed its cultivation and use with a sophistication that European science was only beginning to approximate. These people did not own the wine, did not share in its commercial success, and did not receive acknowledgement in the Mariani albums. The photograph of the Peruvian coca farmer on the wine's label was a decorative invocation of authenticity, not a gesture of attribution or compensation. This is, to put it plainly, not a comfortable fact. The 20th century arrived with a new tone in the conversation about cocaine, driven partly by genuine medical concern, partly by the racial politics of the American South, and partly by the first coherent international effort to regulate drug supply. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required that patent medicines disclose their active ingredients, a seemingly modest requirement that had the immediate effect of making cocaine's presence in consumer products visible and therefore debatable. Products that had been sold for decades as tonics and restoratives were now required to announce that they contained a stimulant, and the announcement changed how people thought about what they had been consuming. Vin Mariani itself faced increasing pressure, and Mariani began reducing the cocaine content of his wine and eventually reformulating it, a practical response to a regulatory environment that was tightening and a public opinion that was shifting. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 effectively criminalized non-medical cocaine use in the United States, and similar legislation followed across Europe. The era of cocaine as a respectable consumer product was ending, not with a dramatic single moment, but with the accumulation of regulation, stigma, and a gradually changing medical understanding of what the substance actually did over time. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 is one of the less dramatically narrated moments in American legislative history, but its consequences were significant far beyond the specific harms it was designed to address. The Act required labeling, and labeling required transparency, and transparency about what consumer products actually contained was, in a market where patent medicines had been trading on vagueness, an implication for decades, a genuinely disruptive demand. Manufacturers who had relied on the mystique of their preparation, the secret formula, the proprietary blend, the unnamed active ingredient that produced such reliable results, were now required to name the things, and when they named them, consumers could read the names, and what many consumers discovered was that the preparation their physician had recommended, the tonic they had been taking for their nervous exhaustion, the wine that made the afternoon bearable contained cocaine. Some of them were surprised, some of them were not particularly surprised. Some of them found their relationship with the product clarified in a way that changed their use of it. The Harrison Act of 1914 is, in retrospect, one of the more consequential pieces of drug legislation in American history, both for what it did and for how it was subsequently interpreted. The Act was framed as a tax measure, requiring registration and taxation of cocaine and opiate transactions, rather than an outright prohibition, because pure prohibition was constitutionally uncertain at the time. But the administrative regulations that accompanied it, and the enforcement priorities that followed, effectively prohibited non-medical use of the named substances, and the medical exceptions were interpreted increasingly narrowly over the years following its passage. The transition from a world in which cocaine was a legal consumer product to a world in which it was a controlled substance subject to criminal sanction was accomplished largely through regulatory interpretation rather than explicit legislative prohibition, which made it legally complex and socially confusing, and contributed to the unevenness of enforcement that would characterize American drug policy for the next century. International pressure also played a role that is often understated. The Shanghai Opium Commission of 1909 and the Hague Convention of 1912 were the first significant international agreements on drug control, and while their immediate force was limited, they established the principle that drug supply was a matter of international rather than purely domestic governance, a principle that would shape the global drug regulatory architecture for the rest of the century. These agreements concerned both opiates and cocaine, and their existence created political pressure on signatory governments to align domestic legislation with the international framework. This pressure was part of what drove the Harrison Act and its equivalents in other countries, giving cocaine regulation its first genuinely global dimension. Angelo Mariani died in 1914, the same year that Harrison effectively closed the American market that had made him wealthy, and there is something almost too neat about the timing, as if the era and its most emblematic figure had agreed to depart together. He died at his villa on the island of Jersey, wealthy, celebrated, and entirely unaware of the designation that later history would apply to his creation. He had spent 50 years building something that had been, by every measure available to him at the time, a success. A product that sold, a product that worked, a product that the most famous people in the world had endorsed with apparent sincerity, a product that had made him rich and made him welcome in the salons and palaces of the most powerful nations on earth. He had not considered himself a drug manufacturer. He had considered himself a pharmacist, a vintner, a man of science who had identified a therapeutic substance and found an elegant way to deliver it. The verdict of the century that followed, that he had been, however unintentionally, one of the primary architects of the global cocaine trade, was not one he lived to receive, and we cannot know whether he would have recognized its justice. His villa on Jersey was the physical expression of his success, comfortable, well-appointed, situated on an island whose mild climate and cultural insularity suited a man who had spent decades in the social world of Paris and was by the end of his life ready to be somewhat insulated from it. He maintained his correspondence, continued to manage the Mariani operation, and received visitors who made the trip from France to sit with the man who had put cocaine in wine and watched the world drink it. He was not a recluse. He remained interested in his work and in the world, but the world had changed around him in ways that must have been difficult to track from Jersey, and the product that he had made as a straightforward pharmaceutical preparation was being transformed, in the public understanding, into something considerably more complicated. His legacy in the wine industry was modest. Vin Mariani was never really a wine in the serious sense, never a collector's item or a connoisseur's object, and the wine trade did not claim him as one of its own in the way that the pharmaceutical trade might have, if that trade had a better relationship with its history. His legacy in marketing was enormous and entirely unacknowledged, because nobody in the 1920s was writing the history of the celebrity endorsement and tracing it back to a Corsican pharmacist who had sent bottles of cocaine wine to the Pope. His legacy in pharmacology is real and documented, forming part of the record of cocaine's introduction to Western medicine that subsequent researchers have used to understand both the substance and the medical system that endorsed it. The most honest thing to say about Mariani's legacy is that it is inseparable from the legacy of cocaine itself, and cocaine's legacy is one of the most complicated in the history of pharmacology. The substance is genuinely useful. It is also genuinely dangerous. The path from genuine usefulness to widespread harm runs straight through the career of the man on Jersey who died in 1914, with clean hands and a clear conscience, and a product that the century following him has never entirely resolved. The deepest irony in the Vin Mariani story is not that a pope endorsed cocaine wine, or that Thomas Edison credited it with his productivity. The deepest irony is what the wine became, what it spawned, what it transformed into over the course of a century of reformulation, regulation and branding. Coca-Cola, which traces its direct lineage through Pemberton's French wine coca to Vin Mariani's original formulation, continued to contain trace amounts of cocaine-removed coca leaf extract, decocainized, chemically processed, stripped of its active alkaloid until well into the 20th century, and continues to use the extract as a flavouring agent today, with the cocaine removed but the leaf's other compounds still contributing to the beverage's distinctive character. The most consumed soft drink in human history is, in a strictly chemical lineage sense, a descendant of Angelo Mariani's cocaine wine, the brand that became synonymous with American cultural values, with wholesome refreshment, with the opposite of pharmaceutical excess, carries in its name and its formula a direct inheritance from a Corsican pharmacist who put coca leaves in Bordeaux and gave the Pope a bottle and watched the world fall in love with the result. The transition from Vin Mariani to Coca-Cola is a story about what happens to a substance when it moves from the pharmacy to the market, from a context in which its chemistry is acknowledged and its use is medically supervised to a context in which its chemistry is obscured and its use is commercially promoted. Pemberton's original French wine coca was honest about what it contained. Coca and wine, as the name said, in a preparation that did what it said. Coca-Cola was honest about what it was named after, the coca leaf and the cola nut. But as the cocaine was reduced and then eliminated and then replaced with decocainized extract, the product's identity drifted from pharmaceutical to beverage without a moment of explicit acknowledgement that the thing that had made it work had been removed. The consumer who switched from Vin Mariani to Coca-Cola in 1900 was not told that the active ingredient was no longer present. They were told that the beverage was refreshing, invigorating, and wholesome, which it was, in the sense that the caffeine remained, and the flavour remained, and the carbonation remained, and these were genuine pleasures. But the cocaine, which had been doing the heavy lifting in both the wine and the original cola, was gone. The Coca-Cola Company's relationship with its own history on this point is instructive. The company has generally acknowledged the coca leaf connection, while being careful to note that its contemporary products contain no cocaine, which is accurate, and to avoid dwelling on the period during which they did, which is understandable, but represents a form of selective corporate memory. The fact that the world's most recognized brand name contains, in its first 4 letters, the direct reference to a substance that is now illegal to possess without a prescription, that the second word in the name refers to a stimulant that was added to replace the first one, and that the drink was created by a pharmacist who was explicitly imitating a cocaine wine. None of this appears prominently in the brand's self-presentation, which tends to focus on polar bears and happiness, and the feelings of community that come from sharing a cold drink on a warm afternoon. The irony is not that Coca-Cola is bad or dishonest. The irony is that the transformation of cocaine from a respectable therapeutic product to a dangerous controlled substance required, along the way, the invention of one of the most successful consumer products in history, and that this product continues to carry, in its name and its formula, a faint chemical memory of the wine that started everything. Angelo Mariani never tasted a Coca-Cola, but Coca-Cola tastes, in its lineage if not in its chemistry, like something he would have recognized. The Victorian approach to cocaine, enthusiastic adoption, medical endorsement, commercial distribution, eventual belated concern, looks, from the present, like a case study in the failure of short-term thinking applied to long-term problems. But it is worth being precise about what Victorian medicine actually got wrong, because the error was not simple ignorance. Cocaine does work. It relieves fatigue, elevates mood, suppresses appetite, and functions as a genuine local anesthetic. The therapeutic applications were real. The endorsements were not false. Where the era failed was in its understanding of time. in its inability to think pharmacologically about what happens not after 1 dose or 10 doses, but after 100 doses, not in the individual who takes a course of treatment and stops, but in the population of people who take a course of treatment and find, to their bewilderment and distress, that stopping is no longer straightforward. The 19th century had the pharmacology and lacked the epidemiology. It understood what cocaine did in an experiment and could not yet see what cocaine did in a society. Vin Mariani was not a lie. It was a truth told too soon, before the full story was available, with consequences that arrived after the telling was already done. Victorian medicine's genuine achievements in this period deserve acknowledgement before its failures are catalogued, because the era's medical progress was real, and its application of cocaine as a local anaesthetic specifically was one of the significant advances in the history of surgery. Carl Kohler's demonstration in 1884 that cocaine could anaesthetize the eye, allowing ophthalmic surgery to be performed without general anesthesia, was a genuine breakthrough that improved outcomes for thousands of patients and opened the path toward the entire field of local anesthesia that is now so fundamental to medicine that its origins are rarely considered. The same substance that Mariani was putting in wine was in operating theatres across Europe, making surgery possible in ways that had not been possible before. This dual identity, useful medicine and a recreational product simultaneously, is not unusual in the history of pharmacology, but it is particularly vivid in the case of cocaine, and it complicates any simple moral narrative about the era's medical choices. Where Victorian medicine most systematically failed was in its model of what harm looked like and how quickly it arrived. The medical ethics of the period were organised around visible, acute harm, the patient who deteriorated visibly in the short term after receiving a treatment, chronic harm that accumulated over months and years, harm that was experienced by the patient as a continued need for treatment rather than as a consequence of treatment, was outside the normal framework of medical evaluation. The patient who returned for more Vin Mariani month after month was not, in this framework, experiencing a harm. They were experiencing a continued need. The harm was invisible because the framework for seeing it had not yet been built, and the building of that framework required exactly the accumulation of cases that the framework's absence prevented from being properly categorized. The lesson that 20th century medicine drew from the cocaine episode, that the medical and commercial endorsement of a powerful psychoactive substance requires systematic long-term study of its effects in populations rather than individual clinical observation in the short term, was a genuine lesson, hard won, and it shaped the regulatory structures that govern pharmaceutical development today. The randomized controlled trial, the long-term safety study, the post-market surveillance requirement, all of these are in part responses to what happened with cocaine in the Victorian era. They did not prevent subsequent episodes of the same pattern, because the pattern is resistant to regulatory intervention in ways that the regulatory frameworks have not entirely solved, but they made the episodes smaller and the recognitions faster than they would otherwise have been. The story of cocaine's transition from medical product to prohibited substance cannot be told honestly without acknowledging the role that racial ideology played in driving American prohibition, because the science alone did not explain the urgency of the legislation or the specific fears that animated it. In the early 20th century American South, a set of beliefs about cocaine's effects on black men, beliefs that were fabricated, racist, and extensively circulated in newspapers and political speeches, became a significant driver of prohibition advocacy. The claim, which had no basis in evidence, was that cocaine made black men violent, uncontrollable, and dangerous to white women. This narrative, repeated in the popular press and cited in legislative debates, served the function of converting a drug policy question into a racial control question, and attached the urgency of racial terror to what might otherwise have been a more gradual regulatory process. The Harrison Act was not solely a product of this racism. There were genuine medical concerns, genuine international pressure, genuine public health arguments, but the specific speed and severity of American cocaine prohibition cannot be understood without it. The history of drug regulation in America is consistently also a history of race, and Vin Mariani's descendants in the American market were caught in this particular story when it arrived. The newspaper coverage of cocaine in the American South in the years between 1900 and 1914 reads, in its racial content, as one of the more disturbing chapters in the history of American journalism. Articles with titles that would be unprintable in any contemporary publication made claims about the effects of cocaine on black Americans that were not supported by any evidence then available, and that subsequent research has entirely failed to support. These articles described cocaine-induced superhuman strength, immunity to pain, and criminal violence, a profile that had no relationship to the pharmacological reality of cocaine's effects, and everything to do with the racial anxieties of a white Southern society navigating the post-Reconstruction political landscape. The relationship between this narrative and the drug policy that followed it is documented and direct. Congressional testimony in favor of the Harrison Act included explicit references to the cocaine black violence narrative, presented not as anecdote or speculation, but as established fact. Physicians and law enforcement officials testified to experiences that subsequent investigation has been unable to verify, and that the pharmacological literature of the period did not support. The narrative did its political work efficiently. It converted a discussion about pharmaceutical regulation into a discussion about racial danger, and in a political environment where racial danger could be invoked without challenge, the policy outcome was correspondingly decisive. This history matters for the Vin Mariani story, because it shows that the product's eventual prohibition was not simply the result of science catching up with the naive era's pharmacological mistakes. It was also the result of political forces that had nothing to do with the pharmacology of cocaine, and everything to do with the social anxieties of a racially stratified society. Vin Mariani itself, consumed by the affluent white consumer class that constituted its primary market, was not the specific target of the racial narrative. That narrative was directed at cheaper cocaine preparations used by black workers in southern states. But the regulatory framework that prohibited cocaine did not distinguish between Angelo Mariani's elegantly bottled wine and the coca preparations circulating in southern labor camps. They were regulated together because they contained the same substance, even though the political energy that drove the regulation was attached to one and not the other. The history of drug prohibition in America is a history of the law's inability to make the distinctions that its own stated logic requires. Behind the celebrity endorsements and the papal medals and the gleaming advertisements in the Mariani albums, there were quieter stories. The stories that ended up in medical case histories rather than testimonials. The stories of people for whom Vin Mariani had worked magnificently, and then stopped working, and then become necessary in a way that was not precisely therapeutic. Victorian physicians who encountered these cases did not always know what they were looking at. The language of addiction, the concept of physical dependence, the mechanism of tolerance, the particular misery of withdrawal, was not yet standardized in medical discourse in the way it would later become. What physicians recorded instead were descriptions, a patient who could not function without the wine, who had increased his dosage repeatedly to achieve the same effect, who had attempted to stop and had experienced a collapse of energy and mood and capacity that left him unable to work. These descriptions are, reading them now, recognizable. They are textbook cocaine dependence. But the textbook had not yet been written, and the physicians recording these cases were doing so without the conceptual framework that would have allowed them to understand what they were describing. The case histories that survive from the 1880s and 90s are scattered across the medical literature of several countries, published in journals that were not in systematic communication with each other, and described in terminology that varied enough between authors to make pattern recognition difficult even for the most attentive contemporary reader. A German physician describes a patient with cocaine habituation. A French physician describes nervous dependence on a coca preparation. An American physician describes a patient who cannot perform his professional duties without his daily dose of the tonic wine. These are the same phenomenon. Nobody in the 1880s was reading all three journals and making the connection. The epidemic, such as it was invisible in the aggregate because each individual case appeared in isolation. The patients themselves, the people experiencing what we now recognize as cocaine dependence, were experiencing something that the cultural framework of the time provided no adequate vocabulary for. They were not, in their own understanding, addicted to anything. They were taking a medicine that their physician had recommended, or a tonic that was available over the counter in the pharmacy, and they were finding that they needed it in a way that exceeded the original therapeutic rationale. This experience was confusing, and for many patients, frightening, not because they recognized what was happening, but because they did not. They had not intended to be dependent on anything. They had taken a wine that the Pope endorsed. They were not the sort of person who became dependent on substances. And yet here they were, experiencing something that felt like illness when they stopped taking the wine, which was the wine's fault in a way that they could not quite articulate and their physicians could not quite name. The social consequences of cocaine dependence in the Victorian period were, for the affluent consumer class that used Vin Mariani, largely concealed by the wealth and social position that concealed so many other forms of difficulty. The physician who was dependent on his afternoon glass of the wine still saw his patients and managed his household and appeared at dinners. The novelist who could no longer write without the preparation still delivered his manuscript and met his social obligations. The dependence was managed for years in some cases within the ordinary routine of a life that had sufficient structure and sufficient social support to prevent its more visible consequences from appearing. The stories that did become visible, the cases in the medical literature, the public acknowledgements, the eventual institutional interventions, represent a small fraction of the actual pattern, which was broader and quieter, and in most cases never named. And so, here you are. You have travelled through the gaslit salons of Paris, sat at the dinner tables of popes and presidents, watched a Corsican pharmacist build an empire one elegant bottle at a time, and followed that bottle across oceans and decades until it became something unrecognisable and yet somehow entirely familiar. You have watched the most celebrated people in the world reach for the same glass. You have watched a century slowly, reluctantly, begin to understand what was in it. It is a strange kind of history, this one. Not the history of wars or empires or the rise and fall of kingdoms. The history of a feeling, of the particular human desire to be more capable than you are, more energetic than the afternoon allows, more equal to the demands of a world that keeps accelerating and does not slow down to ask whether you are keeping up. Angelo Mariani understood that desire before he had a name for it. He put it in a bottle with a gold label and a Pope's endorsement, and the world lined up to buy it. Because the world always lines up for something that promises to close the gap between how you feel and how you need to feel. What is remarkable, sitting with this story at the quiet end of the evening, is not the cocaine. The cocaine is almost incidental, almost beside the point, in the way that the specific substance is always almost beside the point. What is remarkable is the people. The Pope who found comfort in a flask of something his church would later condemn. The dying general who wrote his finest work against a deadline measured in weeks, sustained by a preparation he had never heard of a year before. The opera singer who discovered that the second act was easier with a glass of the wine, and the novelist who discovered that the fourth hour of a conversation was more interesting, and the overworked mother who discovered that the afternoon was manageable, and the physician who prescribed it, and the patient who returned for it, and neither of them quite had the language for what was happening. They were all just people trying to get through their days, trying to be enough for what the day required. This is not an unusual desire. You know this desire. You have felt it. Probably recently, probably in ways that do not involve anything as dramatic as a 19th century cocaine wine, endorsed by the Bishop of Rome. And yet the desire is the same desire. The gap between capacity and demand is the same gap. What changes across the centuries is only what we reach for to close it, and how well we understand what we are reaching for, and how long it takes us to learn what the closing costs. The Victorian men and women who drank Vin Mariani were not foolish. They were not reckless. They were not morally deficient. They were people doing what people do, trusting the medical authorities, reading the endorsements, observing that the thing worked, and concluding that things that work are good, at least until the evidence of something more complicated begins to accumulate, and the framework for understanding that evidence has had time to be built. The evidence accumulated. The framework was built. It took longer than it should have, and the cost of the delay was paid by people whose names did not appear in the Mariani albums. The coca leaf is still growing in the Andes. It has been growing there for longer than most of what we call civilization has existed. The people who first understood it, who cultivated it and used it, and built their knowledge of it across 8,000 years of careful practice, are still there too. Their story is older than Mariani's, and it will outlast his as well. It is worth knowing that the thing at the centre of this whole extraordinary episode was not invented in a Parisian laboratory. It was tended over millennia by people whose names were never on the label, and in Atlanta, somewhere in the production of the most consumed beverage in human history, a trace of the decocainized coca leaf extract is still being added to the formula, because the flavour profile that Pemberton arrived at in 1886, adapting Mariani's preparation for a market that had just gone dry, turned out to be so distinctive and so appealing that a century of chemical engineering has not found a way to replace it without losing something essential. The cocaine is gone. The leaf remains. Some things persist. So tonight, as you lie in the quiet of your room, far from the gaslit salons as the celebrity albums and the dispensing pharmacies of the 19th century, maybe take a moment to appreciate the distance between a world that put cocaine in wine and sold it to children's mothers as a nervous tonic, and the world you are lying in now. That distance was not travelled easily or quickly. It was built by the slow accumulation of cases and observations and hard-won frameworks, and the particular kind of institutional memory that societies develop when they have made expensive enough mistakes. It is not a perfect distance. The pattern has repeated. It will probably repeat again. But here you are, in your bed, with your blanket and your indoor temperature, and your clean water and your access, if you need it, to medical care that can name what is happening in your body, with a precision that the Victorian physician could not have dreamed of. The afternoon is behind you. The demands of the day have released their hold, at least for the hours between now and morning. You do not need anything to close the gap tonight. The gap is already closed. The day is done. Let the weight of the week drain out through the mattress beneath you. Let your shoulders drop to wherever gravity would take them if you stopped holding them up. Let your breathing slow to the pace of someone who has nowhere to be and nothing left to prove until the morning. The story is told. The bottle is empty. This century has passed. Angelo Mariani made his wine, and the world drank it, and the world learned something, slowly, expensively, in the way that the world tends to learn things. And somewhere in the lineage of everything that came after, the regulation, the reformulation, the long argument about what substances are and what they cost and what they cure and what they only appear to cure, somewhere in all of that is the quiet, stubborn, entirely human fact that people kept trying, kept looking for what would help, kept building the frameworks that the previous generation had not had, kept handing the evidence to the next generation and hoping they would do better with it than the last one had managed. They did sometimes, not always, but sometimes. That is enough to carry you to sleep. Good night.